In October of 1594, on a chilly day in Kyoto, Japan, a large crowd gathered for a public execution. The air was filled with a mix of smoke and a chilling, greasy scent. People from all walks of life, merchants, peasants, samurai, and servants, were drawn together by a morbid curiosity. In the center of the execution ground sat a large black iron cauldron, with steam rising from it. The sound of oil bubbling and simmering was a low, constant noise that seemed to get under everyone's skin. Guards stirred the fire beneath the cauldron, and as new logs were added, the flames grew, casting long, dancing shadows on the faces of two condemned figures. They were kneeling, bound and guarded. One was a man, broad-shouldered despite his restraints, with dark, dirty, matted hair. The other was his son, a small child of about 7, who trembled not from the cold, but from an intense, radiating fear. The man was Ishikawa Goemon, and the child was his son. Soon, they would both be lowered into that cauldron of boiling death. The onlookers were about to witness a final, defiant act of a father's love, a moment that would become a legendary tale. To understand how this horrific moment came to be, you have to look back at the man's life. He lived in the shadows of Japan during the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, which turned the country into a battlefield. It was in this chaotic time, in 1558, that Goemon was born, and his life would lead him to become either the greatest thief in Japanese history or its most beloved folk hero, depending on who told the story. He was born Sanada Kuronoshin to a samurai family. His life might have been one of honor and duty, but fate had other plans. When he was 15, his parents were murdered by men of the Ashikaga shogunate, who had marked his father for death. Goemon's father had simply been on the wrong side of a political divide. Standing over his parents' bodies, the boy's hands shook as he held his father's sword. The men who did this were already gone, leaving only death and the stench of violence behind. In that moment, Sanada Kuronoshin died, and a harder, angrier, more dangerous persona was born. He sought out a new life and became a student of Momochi Sandei, one of the most feared ninja masters of the LGA school. In the mountain strongholds, where shadows were weapons and silence was armor, he learned the arts that would make him legendary. He studied the way of the blade, the secrets of infiltration, and the deadly dance of assassination. But his heart betrayed him when he fell in love with one of his master's concubines. When Momochi Sandei found out, Goemon had two options: exile or death. He chose exile, but not before stealing a precious legendary sword from his master. This theft branded him a nukenin, a runaway ninja, a man without honor or a home. Sanada Kuronoshin disappeared into the mists of history, and from those mists emerged Ishikawa Goemon. His name would become synonymous with both terror and hope, depending on whether you were rich or poor. The late 16th century Kansai region was a place of extreme inequality. Wealth flowed freely to the rich merchants, samurai lords, and Buddhist temples, while peasants struggled to survive on whatever scraps fell from the table. Into this world came Ishikawa Goemon, and he brought with him a different kind of justice. In 1580, on a moonless night in Osaka, Goemon broke into the mansion of a wealthy merchant. He moved silently like a ghost until he was in the merchant's bedroom. He placed the cold steel of his blade against the man's throat. But his motive wasn't simple theft. It was a form of redistribution. He told the merchant that his gold, eared from the sweat and labor of the poor, would find its way back to those who needed it most. By dawn, the merchant's strongboxes were empty, and in the nearby villages, mysterious gifts began to appear. A bag of rice on a widow's doorstep, silver coins pressed into a beggar's hand, medicine for a sick child. The people started whispering his name with reverence. Finally, there was someone who understood their struggles and was willing to risk everything to balance the scales. Goemon and his followers became ghosts in the night, striking the wealthy and powerful and giving their wealth to the poor. Children grew up listening to stories of the noble thief. But legends, as Goemon would discover, attract attention from those who prefer their injustices to remain undisturbed. While Goemon was building his reputation in the shadows, another man was rising to prominence in the full light of day: Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Born a peasant, he had clawed his way up to become one of the most powerful men in Japan. Where Goemon used stealth, Hideyoshi used armies and diplomacy. Where Goemon sought to redistribute wealth, Hideyoshi sought to accumulate it. The two men were mirrors of each other, both rising from nothing through sheer force of will, but their paths would diverge fatally. After the death of his master Oda Nobunaga in 1582, Hideyoshi systematically conquered or negotiated the submission of the warring daimyo. By the 1590s, he stood at the pinnacle of power, ruling a Japan that had known peace for the first time in generations. However, Hideyoshi understood that peace required the elimination of all sources of disorder and all challenges to his authority. In the shadows of his new order, Ishikawa Goemon represented everything he sought to destroy: lawlessness, rebellion, and the romantic notion that a person's individual conscience could triumph over state power. The inevitable confrontation came not through grand design, but through personal tragedy. Goemon's wife Otaki was taken by Hideyoshi's agents. Some say she was killed for her husband's crimes, while others claim she died protecting their son. Regardless of the exact details, her death fueled a rage in Goemon that turned a political enemy into a blood enemy. The man who had been content to steal from the wealthy now thirsted for something more fundamental: revenge. In September of 1594, Goemon entered Fushimi Castle in Kyoto. The castle, which sat like a crown jewel on a hill, seemed impossible to infiltrate, but Goemon had spent decades perfecting the impossible. He moved like a ghost through the castle's maze-like corridors and up the stairs to Hideyoshi's private chambers. Inside, Hideyoshi lay on his futon, sleeping peacefully. Goemon drew his blade, the stolen sword that had been his companion for so many years. One quick thrust, and the tyrant would be dead. But as he prepared to strike, his foot caught the edge of a small table, and a bronze bell tumbled to the floor with a sound that echoed like thunder. The guards poured into the room, and within seconds, Goemon was surrounded. "So," Hideyoshi said, his voice remarkably calm, "the great Ishikawa Goemon finally shows his face." Goemon said nothing. He had failed, and he knew that failure meant not just death, but something far worse. The trial was swift and predetermined. Goemon stood before Hideyoshi in the great hall of Fushimi Castle, his hands bound, his head held high. When asked how he pleaded to the charges of theft, banditry, and attempted assassination, Goemon's response was magnificent in its defiance. Looking directly into Hideyoshi's eyes, he spoke not as a criminal begging for mercy, but as a man who had lived by his own code and was prepared to die by it. "I am guilty of all you have named," he said. "I have stolen from the rich to give to the poor. I have defied the laws of those who would grind the weak beneath their heels. And yes, I have tried to kill you because you are a tyrant who has forgotten that power exists to serve the people, not to dominate them." He continued, saying he was proud to be a criminal and a traitor if his crimes were defying injustice. He told Hideyoshi that others would follow in his footsteps because the poor would always need champions, and tyrants would always breed rebellion. Hideyoshi's face remained impassive, but his fury was building. "You speak of just justice," Hideyoshi replied, his voice dangerously quiet, "but justice requires order." He then delivered a shocking sentence: death by boiling, a punishment so rare and so terrible that it was reserved for only the most heinous crimes. But Hideyoshi wasn't finished. "And since you claim to be a champion of the people," he continued, "let us see how much you truly love them. Your son will share your fate. He will die as you die, slowly and in agony, so that all who witness it will understand the price of defying the rightful order." Goemon's composure, which had held through all of his trials, finally broke. The pain on his face was worse than any physical torture could ever be. "The boy is blameless," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Kill me as you will, but spare the child." But Hideyoshi was merciless. "The child is your child," he replied. "He carries your blood, your name, your legacy of defiance. Japan will be better without both of you." The night before the execution, Goemon sat in his cell with his son pressed against him. The boy, perhaps 7 years old, could feel his father's anguish. "Papa," the child whispered, "are we going to die tomorrow?" Goemon closed his eyes, fighting back tears. "Yes," he said, "we are going to die tomorrow." The boy was quiet for a long moment. "Will it hurt?" he asked. Goemon's voice broke as he answered, "Yes, it will hurt. Will you be with me?" "Yes," Goemon promised, pulling his son closer. "I will be with you. I will hold you, and I will not let go no matter what happens." The boy seemed satisfied with this answer. To him, death was not so frightening if his father was there to face it with him. Goemon spent the rest of the night composing his death poem, a final statement of his beliefs. It read, "Though you may boil a thief's body, you cannot boil away his spirit. Thieves will always exist as long as there are rich and poor." He saw his death not as an end, but as a part of a larger, eternal struggle. At dawn on October 8th, the execution ground was already packed with spectators. The great iron cauldron gleamed dully in the morning sun, and the fire beneath it had been burning since before dawn. The oil was at a temperature that would kill a man in moments. Goemon and his son were brought forward in chains, the boy's small hand clutching at his father's robes. Hideyoshi himself sat on a raised platform, his face impassive as he watched the man who tried to kill him face his final moments. The executioner, a grim-faced man, explained the procedure with clinical detachment. They would be lowered into the oil feet first, a process designed to maximize their agony. But as the guards moved to separate them, Goemon did something that would be remembered for centuries. He lifted his son high above his head, holding him as far from the boiling oil as his strength would allow. The chains that bound him made this an impossible feat, but desperation lent him power. "If you must have our deaths," he shouted, his voice carrying across the silent crowd, "then take mine first. Let the boy die quickly without suffering." The executioner looked to Hideyoshi for guidance, but Hideyoshi's face remained stone, and he nodded for the execution to proceed. The chain lowered, and Goemon's feet touched the surface of the oil. His body arched in agony, but he held his son high above his head. Each inch the chain descended was an eternity of pain, but his arms remained steady. As the oil reached his chest, Goemon's strength finally began to fail. His arms trembled, and the boy began to slip. But instead of letting his son fall into the boiling cauldron, Goemon did something that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives. In one swift, merciful motion, he plunged the child down into the oil with him, killing him instantly. Then, Goemon lifted his son's lifeless body high above his head once more, holding it like a banner of defiance. Even as the oil destroyed his body, he maintained his grip on the child he couldn't save but could at least spare from prolonged agony. The last image the crowd saw was Goemon's face, burned and dying but still defiant, his eyes fixed on Hideyoshi. Then he sank beneath the surface, taking his son with him, and the terrible spectacle was. The execution was meant to be a waiming, a spectacle so terrible that it would crush any thought of rebellion. Instead, it became something else entirely. The image of a father sacrificing everything to protect his child resonated deeply with the common people. Far from destroying his legacy, the execution transformed Goemon from a bandit into a folk hero. His story spread like wildfire, and he became a symbol of resistance to tyranny. The large iron bathtub came to be called a Goemon Bureau in his honor, a darkly ironic tribute that transformed the instrument of his death into a symbol of cleansing and renewal. The true legacy of Ishikawa Goemon is not the theft or the rebellion, but the enduring question his life and death pose. In a world where power is concentrated in the hands of a few, what is the proper response? Goemon chose rebellion, and it cost him everything. Yet in losing his life, he gained something Hideyoshi, for all his power, could never possess: immortality in the hearts and minds of the people. The legend of Ishikawa Goemon reminds us that there are things in this world worth dying for, and that the greatest tragedies often arise from the collision between love and justice.
Thank you for spending time with me today as we uncovered another piece of history. If you enjoyed this story, a like or a share really helps others discover it too. And if you'd like to join me on more journeys into the past, consider subscribing and turning on the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Until then, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next story.